Hello and welcome to The Brief. I'm Jaffar Hasnain. The torturous killing of George Floyd has triggered a new wave of turmoil in the United States. Protests and riots have erupted in many different cities across the U.S. The police is struggling to contain the protests and riots. So what does future entail for the U.S.? Is the turmoil going to exacerbate? What does the President of the United States need to do at this point? And does America have a problem with racial violence and police brutality? We will discuss all this and more in this episode of The Brief. But first, in order to set up the discussion for today, let's have a look at this report.
Shooting smoke bombs currently out of a...
Violent protests have erupted across the United States over the death of George Floyd, an unarmed black man at the hands of a police officer in Minneapolis, Minnesota. More than 75 cities have seen protests. At least 40 cities have imposed curfews, and National Guard members have been activated in 15 states and Washington, D.C. Riot police clashed with protesters in New York, Chicago, Philadelphia and Los Angeles, firing tear gas and pepper bullets to try to disperse the crowds. Police vehicles were set on fire and shops were looted in several cities.
Too many people that have been getting shot. This is getting bad. It's continuously happening. So we need to protest. Protesting works. This is how racism is getting ended. Martin Luther King protested and people heard him out.
In Manhattan's Soho neighborhood, mobs of people rampaged down the sidewalks, smashing into numerous luxury shops to steal merchandise. The New York Police Department arrested more than 200 during protests overnight. Over 4,400 people have been arrested over several days of protests. Secret Service agents rushed President Donald Trump to a White House bunker on Friday night as hundreds of protesters gathered outside the executive mansion, some of them throwing rocks and tugging at police barricades. Trump spent nearly an hour in the bunker, which was designed for use in emergencies like terrorist attacks, according to a Republican close to the White House who was not authorized to publicly discuss private matters and spoke on condition of anonymity. Atlanta's mayor extended a curfew another night on Sunday, and Georgia's governor authorized a deployment of up to 3,000 National Guard troops across the state to respond, if needed, to protests.
All right, welcome back, and now let's introduce the panel for today's discussion. Joining us from Nevada, United States, is Mr. John G. Peters. He's the founder, CEO, and the president of the Institute for the Prevention of In-Custody Deaths. And from New Jersey, New York, we have Mr. Mark Meirowitz. He's a professor at the State University of New York, Maritime College. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us today on The Brief. Mr. Peters, I would like to start with you. Now, you lead an organization that deals with the prevention of in-custody deaths. Please help us understand, what is your analysis of George Floyd's killing?
Well, I think Mr. Floyd was put into a prone position and held on the ground. I did not see him struggling. There was a knee on his neck. Based on the video, Mr. Floyd did raise his head a couple of times, and the officer pushed the head down with his knee. Even after Mr. Floyd went non-responsive, the officer kept his knee on the neck for a little over 2 more minutes. When Mr. Floyd said he couldn't breathe, that should have changed the officer's behavior from dealing with a suspect to dealing with a patient. This is a medical emergency, first and foremost, when Mr. Floyd says, "I can't breathe." And everything should have transitioned to working to get EMS there, providing first aid for Mr. Floyd. Now, the autopsy report that's been released so far shows that Mr. Floyd had plaque in his arteries. The toxicology screen isn't back yet, but in my mind, there was no reason to hold him on the ground. He wasn't struggling, and there was absolutely no reason to ignore his 12 or so requests and statements that he couldn't breathe.
Okay, now Mark, let me come to you. The United States was already going through a tough time. Hundreds of thousands of COVID-19 deaths, millions of confirmed cases, and now the killing of George Floyd has exacerbated the turmoil. This is what I would like to ask you here. Is the United States a stranger to this problem?
Well, I'd like to look a little bit more broadly at this issue at the present time. You find where we are right now in America, we're in a very bad spot with COVID-19. And this, as you say, just adds the most unfortunate event. And what's odd about it, or let's say bizarre about it, is that President Trump himself has called it a grave tragedy and has said it has filled Americans all over with horror and anger. So we're dealing with something very different. Our whole politics, I'm looking at this politically, I'm not, obviously there's no sympathy whatsoever for what occurred. And I don't disagree with Mr. Peters and what he's saying. Clearly that's fairly straightforward. The question is, what should the political ramifications be, and whether or not there should be riots across the country, destroying property and attacking police and destroying police stations and police cars. I would say today's New York Times, Ross Douthat, the columnist from the New York Times, says he believes that the statistics show and the history shows that riots and violent behavior is counterproductive to creating civil rights and a fairer and more just society. And he goes through historically Nixon and others and Wallace and others. And the truth of the matter is, Trump, if you look at Trump does say he's going to send in the National Guard and do all of this. But at the end of the day, if we look at his record on COVID, he's really basically delegated the whole thing to the states. And so we're in a very, very, very difficult situation here. But at the bottom line is, the question is whether or not, and this is really an existential question for the country, we're going to survive COVID-19, and are we going to survive this breakout of violence created in many respects by people who are not interested. And there's one sign I saw at one of the riots in Minneapolis where they wrote, "The system must be destroyed. The system must be unraveled." Well, if this is about the system, I have to say that the whole system in this country with COVID-19 has been disassembled and broken to little pieces. And we're all sitting at home now, and now we're going to suffer again with riots and property destruction. That is very problematic, and that does not in any way forgive anything that occurred here, which is unforgivable. There's absolutely no question about it. There's no question about it. There's no justification for this type of behavior. On the other hand, the question is, what should the repercussions be, and what should people be doing? And would we, I'm from New York City, and in New York City we have people burning and destroying police cars. Even in D.C., I saw, the rioters attacked, a university and destroyed all the windows. What is I don't follow it. It again, Ross Douthat's point in the New York Times is counterproductive. If you want justice, maybe that's not the way to pursue it. And obviously justice needs to be pursued. And I don't disagree with that. The question is, what should we do about it?
Okay, Mark. Now, Mr. Peters, I have the same question for you. As a foreigner, as someone sitting outside the United States, I have read multiple reports of the police in the U.S. using excessive force against African Americans. So this is what I would like to ask you now. How common are such incidents?
Well, I think overall they're fairly rare. I do think that there is certainly data to support that the African American community in the United States does see a higher level of force used against them, and whether that's a result of them being arrested in greater numbers, I don't have that analysis in front of me. But I do think there is a disproportionate showing on use of force. That's been statistically proven. In the case of Mr. Floyd, what I don't understand is the officer was following policy. The policy of the Minneapolis Police Department was that you could put your knee on the neck. There's not a police department in the country of which I'm aware, or in North America for that matter, that I know that is acceptable policy. So when you have a policy like that and you combine that with people you're arresting, and then you see an officer sitting on an African American's back, nonchalant, looking around after being told the person couldn't breathe, after being told, I'm videotaping you, I think what we have is a rogue group of folks, for whatever reason, whether it's personal bias that they bring to the job, and we know there's bias in this country, in various places, it's stronger in some places than others. It's just not acceptable.
Now, Mr. Peters, I do have another question here. You have raised a very interesting point that it was part of Minneapolis police's policy to put a knee over someone's neck. Why do they do that? Can you please help our audience understand?
Well, there's no real reason to justify it. About 10 years ago, I actually was invited to present at the Minneapolis Police Academy, and I told them, we don't put knees on the neck. That practice went away about 30 years ago. Obviously, advice is to give. It's up to the agency to take it, but this starts at the top. So when you have a policy, it's authorized by the chief of police to do this, and then you have officers who have discretion as to when to do it, how long to do it, and to whom. It's just, when you look at the calculus of this, it brings together all the ingredients for a major tragedy, as we saw this past week. I don't know why the police chief allowed this to continue. I don't know why the science and the evidence and the medical information was ignored on this particular issue, but it needs to stop, and it needs to stop now.
Okay, now Mark, let me come to you. I would like your comments on President Donald Trump's way of handling this whole situation. I was going through President Trump's Twitter account, and I noticed that about a few weeks ago, when protests erupted in Michigan due to coronavirus lockdown, he used a completely different tone to address the issue in comparison to the one he used after the killing of George Floyd. So again, as someone sitting outside the United States, it would appear to some that the president is engaging in some sort of a discrimination. So please tell me, what is your navigation through this?
Well, first of all, before I go on to your point, I wanted to add to Mr. Peters' point that Officer Chauvin, who was involved here, had 18 complaints of misconduct against him before, which were not adjudicated. I think only 2 were closed without finality. So in other words, so therefore the department there, the administration, needs to do a full house cleaning and administrative cleaning, not just on the issue that Mr. Peters indicates, but on how come somebody can have 18 complaints like that of misconduct and still be on the force. I don't think that would happen in the NYPD, but of course we had the Eric Garner case, which was very similar, where Eric Garner said, I can't breathe, very, very similar. In that case, I don't think the police were charged. Ultimately, they were fired, but I don't think charges were brought against them. To answer your question about the very good people, it's also important to remember that Trump used that language in Charlottesville when we had the neo-Nazis and the Ku Klux Klan riot, and someone was actually killed in that event. He said they were very good people. Now, this terminology is very, very problematic. I should also point out that I've read all the president's tweets, and what the president focuses on is the Antifa, which is basically the left protesters. The problem is that we cannot have extremism on the left or the right. We cannot have a society survive unless we condemn the left and the right, and extremism on the left and the right, and that is something the president, again, remember, Trump is running for re-election in November, and everything that the president does is geared to being reelected. So he's trying to connect with his base and attacking the Antifa and calling people good people. As far as the Michigan case, that had to do with COVID-19, and that one was totally political to connect with the base and show them that he was supporting what they were doing. At the end of the day, though, the big picture here and the big takeaway here in this scenario is that a society like the United States, I don't think any society, Turkey or anywhere else in the world, can survive if you have policemen and police cars and police stations destroyed. They're just, seeking justice in that fashion is, as the editorial writer says, is counterproductive. It turns people off. It turns people off to the goal, which has to be justice. And along the lines Mr. Peters is talking about, and certainly has issued the misconduct complaints, that you shouldn't have a police department that functions that way. But whether that is a justification for widespread mayhem and violence, and again, against the police and other authority figures, is a wide question that we should discuss. But I think that people hunkered down in their homes are now doubly confused and upset beyond COVID-19 to see this going on. We feel hopeless and helpless in this scenario where the society seems to be falling apart. So, like I say, getting justice is the key, but how you get the justice is a question, an existential question for this country. And again, Trump's statements in this respect clearly deserve to be criticized, and they're really not appropriate to call good people. But on the other hand, I pointed out that Trump specifically in this case, he actually condemned the killing of Mr. Floyd and said it was a tragedy. And that's very different than his usual terminology.
Okay, now, Mr. Peters, an interesting question here. When George Floyd was being killed by Derek Chauvin, many cops were present as well. And those cops did not really do anything to stop Derek Chauvin or even raise their voice against what he was doing. So do you think silence is tantamount to complicity?
Absolutely. In the United States, I would not be surprised if those officers were not charged. Certainly, they could be sued civilly for failure to intervene. We have a standard in this country that when officers see something that shouldn't be done by another officer, they have a duty to step up and intervene. But this goes back to the organizational climate. Officers will do what they think their supervisors will allow them to get away with. And if I work for a very strict supervisor, I won't do much other than what the supervisor wants. But if I work for a supervisor that's laissez-faire and allows me to do a lot of different things, this is what we call unwritten ground rules. This is the subculture of the department, and that needs to be identified. These officers who stood around were complicit, in my opinion. They also should have intervened and stopped it. But again, we have, which is well documented in this country, what's called the wall of silence or the code of silence or whatever you want. And it could be that the officer, in this case, who had so many complaints against him, possibly also threatened his coworkers, and they know that, and they would not step up.
Okay, now Mark, talking about riots. Of course, the situation at the moment is dire. Riots and protests are erupting in many different cities across the United States. But some would say that, some would quote Martin Luther King here, that riots are the voice of the unheard. So please tell me, what is your navigation through this? What do you think about this whole situation?
Well, I mean, if you're talking about Martin Luther King, I mean, Martin Luther King, to me, as a disciple of Gandhi, would have been very upset about this scenario. I mean, certainly King became a little more radical towards the end about Vietnam, but at the end of the day, the tradition here, civil disobedience, is something that he believed in, and I have to say that really underscores the points that we've been talking about, in the sense that that was the clincher, that people saw the sheriff bring the dogs on the bridge and attack people like King who are defenseless, that people said, you know, enough is enough. We've had enough. You get a lot more out of that than you do out of violent protest. I would like to add, though, on the duty to intervene, if I may. I mean, I'm also a lawyer, and I hear what you're saying about that, but I think that the recourse there is really more in the civil realm, as Mr. Peters indicates. If people are going to bring lawsuits and they're going to prevail, then that will put a chilling effect on this type of behavior. But the general rule, at least that I learned in law school, was that police do not have a duty to protect you. In other words, and I'm being very general here. In other words, this is the Kitty Genovese case where a woman was crying out, somebody was attacking her, and the police didn't come, and someone sued, and the Court of Appeals said there's no generalized duty to protect. So the question is whether the police has a duty to intervene would be a fact-determined scenario. And that's exactly, I think, what Mr. Peters was indicating. In this case, if you have the police standing there where somebody is killing somebody, that would seem to rise to a level where somebody should do something about it. And this is police culture, and we've said that before as police officers, and we saw this in the case of Serpico in New York City. You know, the police don't like to, you know, intervene and cause problems for other police officers. And the culture, that's a cultural issue, and it is somewhat problematic. I mean, there's no doubt about it. In this case, it would appear that the police officers who were there should have done something about it, but they didn't. But again, it goes back to the fact that why is Chauvin on the force when he's got all these complaints against him, and nobody's ever adjudicated them? And the district, I mean, it just flies. It's kind of a bad situation that went rotten, and it went rotten and bad in the worst possible time in this country. Not the worst possible time, but with COVID-19, the country is so on tenterhooks, where everyone is all stressed out over COVID-19. This scenario, this awful scenario occurs, and then suddenly there's like, people just get all upset about it to such an extent, and it's understandable you should get upset about it, but the COVID-19 exacerbated it. We said that before. People were very, very upset about that, and now this thing came, and it was kind of, gee whiz, this is kind of the tip of the eye, this is it. Now we're not going to take that anymore. So hopefully things will quiet down. That's what I'm saying.
Okay, now, Mr. Peters, like I mentioned earlier, as someone sitting outside the United States, as a foreigner, we do hear reports of police violence against African Americans. And now I'm speculating here. After the killing of George Floyd, the African American community's trust in the police is going to dramatically go down. Of course, this is hypothetical, but if it does go down, what would it take for the police to restore that trust?
Well, that's a very good question. I think what the police need to do is communicate more with the communities, and particularly, to address your question, the African American community. And they need to take a multi-pronged approach to that. In the 1970s, there was a theory in the United States that if you took African American police officers and put them into an African American community, it would work better and it would smooth things over. And that proved to be rather disastrous because the African American community viewed a lot of the black officers as traitors. You went on the other side. So I think we have to take a multi-pronged approach to this. The community needs, first of all, to be reassured that the police department in that area doesn't have these type of practices. They don't put knees on the neck. They don't hold people down for an extended period of time when it's not necessary. And I think they have to take a very soft approach in the beginning. They have to educate the community, and they have to build trust. It takes a long time to build trust. It only takes a second to break it. And now that rebuilding is going to take a lot of time, and it's going to take a community effort. I would suggest the police department bring in members of the community. All of them serve as a team or a task force and go out and speak. But what's really going to convince the community is behavior. If the officer's behavior shows that they respect the community, and that's the key word here, there has to be respect on both sides. And I think that's what's lost when this type of chain effect takes effect in communities. The respect is gone, the trust is gone, and it's going to take a long time to rebuild.
Okay, now Mark, my last question to you. What kind of message do you think the US President Donald Trump needs to send out to the African American community? The situation at the moment is indeed dire. Protests and riots are erupting in many different cities across the United States, so something needs to be done, right?
Well, I would say that would hope that the president doesn't, let's say, overreact to this and start putting in, federal troops and make a situation worse than it is. And hopefully the situation will improve. I would point out, though, that in Minneapolis, the police chief is an African American, is Chief Arredondo, and he's in a very tough situation. But I think that's a good thing. And I think putting African American police officers and promoting them into positions of importance and leadership is important. That sends a certain message. And he was very, very upset about this. And it reflects on the department and reflects on him. So I'm hoping that, peace will prevail. And I would, you mentioned Martin Luther King before, and Martin Luther King made a very interesting comment. He said, every time a riot develops, it helps George Wallace. And remember, George Wallace was a racist governor who stood there and didn't allow African-American young people to register in a university. So the point is that what we have to hope for is the president doesn't overreact. And secondly, we want to have a lot of Martin Luther King's philosophy prevail in this country, and people work hard together to make sure that this type of scenario does not occur. It's unforgivable and inexcusable, but we can't debate it or discuss it or work on justice when we're in the middle of buildings and police and fires and destruction. People can't concentrate when they see that. They're completely distracted. So if that can calm down and we can work together on this, or with already strapped governments that are already strapped to the limit with this COVID thing, to try to work to prevent it, that is inexcusable. And the first thing they should do is shouldn't have officers with 18 complaints sitting around there and going out and interacting with the community and with people when they should be, maybe put on a desk or discharged. They shouldn't be interacting with people, because at the end of the day, you're just going to have problems like this. So a lot of housekeeping and house cleaning is needed, but also everybody has to calm down. So a lot of Martin Luther King, and Trump should step back and let the Martin Luther King philosophy prevail, and let's all work on, I'm trying to be optimistic. It's a difficult situation all around, but I'm going to try to be and hope that these types of things are not repeated, because they're just horrible. What can you say about it?
I hope peace prevails and that tensions de-escalate as soon as possible. On that note, Mr. John G. Peters and Mark Meirowitz, thank you very much for talking to us on The Brief. We really appreciate your analysis. Thank you very much once again, and please stay safe. All right, this brings us to the end of another episode of The Brief. Before I say goodbye, I would just like to say that the torturous killing of George Floyd could very well become the epitome of racial superiority in the most powerful country on the planet. His killing serves as a reminder that no matter how progressive the world has become, racists and bigots still live among us. We just don't know who they are. On that note, I'm Jaffar Hasnain, and I'll see you with another episode of The Brief very soon.